When you look back at the history of black people here in America, once we were free from slavery, we were successful in ways, and we overcame things, and we did things far beyond our predecessors could have imagined, simply because we had that almost instinctively in us.
As blacks emerged from slavery, a minute percentage could read or write, and yet in half a century, over half the black population was literate. An economic historian has called that one of the most remarkable things in history.
So in the late 1800s, we had actually a not very well documented boon of African-American proliferation into the political space, into the entrepreneurial space. And we had real movers and shakers in our communities who were doing real things.
Because at one time, blacks were Republicans, and you dominated those 7 years after the Civil War. You were Republicans. You had more blacks in the House and Senate than you do now, and you dominated your own economic and communities. You did that as Republicans.
But then what happened was that Democrats realized they could still control us by enacting new laws to suppress our civil liberties. That brings us to the rise of Jim Crow. The Jim Crow era and Ruby Bridges going to school, that happened in the 1950s and 1960s, that general era. But we had Hiram Rhodes rebels and many other African Americans rise to positions of power in the political space in the late 1800s. So there's this gap of missing achievement that we have, and that is what the KKK, that is what the Jim Crow laws did to our community.
You can't depend on a government school to teach you raw history.
You're gonna see people like even Frederick Douglass become less and less and less celebrated and less and less and less popular because he doesn't really fit the narrative. He was a Republican, very American.
When they want to teach you somebody that was great in Black American history and they happen to be Republican, they don't tell you that element. And they also, and this is sort of one of the biggest myths that they tell you, that the party's completely switched.
They have to say the party switched. They have to. Because they can't acknowledge that they are part of all of the worst things that have ever happened to black people in history. And if you know better and you know the parties didn't switch and you just look at today, they're still a part of every negative thing that have happened to black people in America.
Let's just take one issue. And that's the issue we've talked about for a long time, and that's vouchers.
They have to pass through metal detectors. They're faced by security guards looking for hidden weapons. They're watched over by armed police.
You're required to send your kid to a school where only 3% of kids can do math at grade level because you have no option. Republicans want you to have an option, but Republicans, of course, are racist, so you can't vote for them, right? What a dilemma.
Slave codes in the early 19th century made it illegal for Black Americans to learn to read. Why? Because if slaves could read, they could access information. I don't believe that much has changed.
If the parties did switch and Democrats really are the party of, for, and by minorities, then why do they react so viciously when you introduce legislation that would help the minorities by giving them school choice? There's answers to all these questions, but you have to be the one to find them because no one else is going to tell you the inconvenient truth. The welfare state is slavery 2.0.
The biggest falsehood, the biggest lie that gets repeated is that the kind of disorganization and chaos and violence and self-destruction that we're witnessing in the black community is somehow a legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. That is just a lie.